Basically, Nebraska has a unicameral system, which means a couple of things. One, it's a single house body. It meets every year. The Constitution limits the number of days that the legislature meets to 90 days during odd number years and 60 legislative days during even number of years. And those are not consecutive days in a row, but those are days in which the legislature actually convenes, does business until they adjourn for the day, and then they come back the next day. But basically, the rules provide that the first 10 days of each session, whether it's a 90-day session or a 60-day session, during the first 10 days, any senator can introduce as many bills as they want to introduce. The tricky thing is the legislature has a rule that if you want to make a law change, whether it's amending a current law or bringing a whole new law into being, you have to introduce it during the 10 days, and you have to have a public hearing on that. And that's to give the public an opportunity to know what you're doing. That way you just don't slam dunk a law change on the last day of session that no one's ever heard about, right? It kind of gives that opportunity. And so the rules require a process of bill introduction and a committee having a hearing and that sort of thing. We're kind of in an odd spot during the session, and that is it's going to be difficult, well, not difficult, but certainly not impossible to introduce a whole new bill that goes much farther than implicit bias training, whether that's banning chokeholds, whether that's requiring law enforcement officers to have actual training on protest rights, whether it's having prosecutors, not cops, but actual prosecutors have some sort of anti-bias training so that they can understand issues of race when they charge cases, whether it's actually repealing some problematic laws that tend to hurt people of color more than others, like mandatory minimum laws, or bail reform and banning cash bail, or whether it's amending our drug laws. I mean, the statistics are all there. They've always been there, but like we talked earlier, it's come to the forefront now. To do anything like that could certainly be done. There's two ways the legislature can do that. One, they could just suspend their own rules and have a special hearing. And they've got time to do that. And a number of senators, Senator Wayne mentioned a couple of things about doing that. Senator Chambers has as well. They could always do that in the 17 days that they have. A whole other separate issue, and this is something that's not used all that often, would be for the legislature to call themselves into special session after these 17 legislative days are done. In other words, when they're done doing the budget, when they're done doing everything else that they're sort of working on already, including the good bills that we talked about, they can come back for a special session that's focused solely on criminal justice reform, police practice reform, those sorts of things. The legislature has gone into special session themselves a number of times. They've done it for budgetary issues when the states run out of money between sessions. They've done it, for instance, they did it in the Keystone Pipeline when they needed to get the law changed to accommodate the pipeline site. They can do that all the time. And in many respects, that'd be an appropriate thing to do, in my opinion. This is a unique issue. It's a unique time. It's important for people. We had sustained protests nationwide on this issue, and those protests were really singular and focused. It wasn't, despite what people said that were opposed to the protests, the messaging was pretty clear. The messaging was consistent. We want change in this way. Hear us. This is what we want. This is really a unique opportunity for the legislature to go into special session. They could do that themselves. Any 10 senators can request that they go into special session, and then they vote on it, basically. Or alternatively, the governor can always call the senators into special session as well. We are in the midst now, we're in the middle of the second year of the 2-year biennium, the 60-day session. And normally in non-COVID years, right, we'd already be done with the session because 60 days is usually done sometime in April, maybe May if they go a little bit longer. But here we are in July, still in the midst of session, and we'll be resuming in a couple of weeks.
Have you seen any bills like related to policing and the racial equality stuff that you were talking about? Have you seen any of those brought to the floor recently?
One bill that deals with sort of police authority was a bill that Senator Ernie Chambers did. It's LB 924, and it's actually only one vote away from going to the governor. LB 924 was introduced originally by Senator Chambers to address the perennial problem, the persistent problem of racial profiling. The state ostensibly bans racial profiling, which means officers are not supposed to stop people of color, right, disproportionately. you make a traffic stop based on a traffic violation and nothing more, right? But what we know, because what we see, because police departments are required across the state, whether it's the State Patrol, the Omaha Police Department, or some local sheriff's office somewhere, they're required to sort of note the race and the race or ethnicity of the person that they stop, and you issue a citation to or warrant. And what we know from regular annual data that's sent to the Crime Commission in our state is that people of color are consistently stopped more by law enforcement.
Mm-hmm.
This is a problem that, of course, every law enforcement agency maintains. We don't racial profile, yet the numbers tell something different, tell something otherwise. So Senator Chambers' bill is meant to address this, and that is to require every law enforcement officer in this state, whether they're a sheriff, state trooper, city cop somewhere, to, as part of their annual training, to do at least 2 hours of implicit bias training and anti-bias training. To be a cop, to be a certified law enforcement officer, an officer has to have at least 20 hours a year of some sort of ongoing training. And that can be anything from textbook training on new developments in the law, it can be weapons training, it can be really anything that relates to their job duties as being a cop. Senator Chambers mandated that in addition to the 20 you do, you're going to do 2 hours a year, which is really a small ask. But it's 2 hours a year you have to do this, focus on trying to figure out a little bit about yourself as a police officer, understanding the concept of bias, explicit and implicit bias, and those kinds of things. And that bill is already kind of going along the way. Now, that bill could be amended to capture more than what Senator Chambers originally introduced when he required the training, but it does deal with that. It's a small step in the system, but it does deal with that persistent problem, as I said before, of racial profiling. That's one bill that deals with police training and police responsibility. Another bill that deals with, people of color, and this is more of a basic sort of dignity issue. And it's LB 1060. It's introduced by Senator Michaela Cavanaugh, and it's on the second round of debate on the floor. And it prohibits employers from discriminating against people because of their natural hairstyle. And this is something that really sort of impacts all people of color, but particularly women of color, where employers on occasion would tell employees, don't have an afro, do something different with your dreadlocks, do something different there because it's not professional, doesn't look seemly, it doesn't look nice. And it's a subtle yet quite offensive way of discriminating against people. And that bill was really well received. A number of different people testified in support of that bill. It was advanced from the Business and Labor Committee. Senator Cavanaugh made it her priority bill. And by priority bill, each senator can designate one bill they want to come ahead of all the other ones, and that's her priority bill. And it's on, as I said before, the second round of debate. And that's something that, while it's not dealing directly with police power, does deal with providing some sort of protection, and I think another word I've used it a couple times before, dignity, if you will, for people of color. Another bill that deals with people of color and race relations is Senator Justin Wayne's LB 918. LB 918 and 918 creates a commission on African American affairs. It's a 14-member commission that would look at different issues in this state, whether it's legislative issues, employment issues, local government issues, issues in education. It would look for issues through the prism of protecting African Americans and their interests in the state. We already have a Mexican American Commission, we have a Native American Commission. This would create an African American Commission to systematically look at issues that are unique to African Americans in this state. And that bill is one vote away from going to the governor as well. And then finally, one bill, actually, this is something that's more of a rule change, but it's important, and it's LR, and it's not an LV because it's a legislative resolution, but it's LR 213213, Senator Tony Vargas's legislative resolution. And that would provide, it's something that really pertains to the legislature, but it would require the legislature to include a racial impact statement or a racial impact assessment whenever they consider law changes. The best way to compare it is if you follow the legislature, you'll hear or you'll know that sometimes when somebody introduces a bill, whether it deals with providing Medicare for all or providing some sort of tax incentive or some sort of tax on somebody, the legislature always attaches what they call a fiscal note. And that is some sort of assessment done by the Legislative Fiscal Office to basically say, this is what this bill is going to cost. It's either going to cost the state X amount of money or it's going to save the state this much money. Senator Vargas wants to do that slightly different, and a number of states have done this, including Iowa, to require that bills that deal with issues like juvenile justice, criminal justice, education, these things where we see issues trend consistently against people of color, to have what they call a racial impact assessment or a racial impact statement to that bill. In other words, we're going to pass this law. How is it going to hurt people of color? Or is it going to hurt people of color? Or is it going to help people of color? Or is it going to have any impact whatsoever? And it's a good, it's a very insightful way that Senator Vargas looked at this, because it would at least would have a constant mechanism, right? So that people could know from the front, if we're going to pass this law, this might happen, or this will likely happen. And it's a good way to improve the process, particularly, as I said before, when it comes to areas of law which are just starkly different for people who are white and people who are of color. There's a couple ways they could do something more substantive than they did as far as bill introductions. There's a number of bills that touch on these issues. LB 646, the Senator Chambers bill that bans cash bail. LB 881 that's pending has a number of modest reforms that deal with criminal justice reform, sentencing reform, and some reform to cash bail. But there could be so much more that could be done. So I'm optimistic. If they can't get it done this session, they can always come back in special session, and there's certainly next year in January when they reconvene.
Mm-hmm. So with the makeup of the legislature right now, what do you think the odds are of like these bills that we've talked about getting passed?
Well, Senator Chambers' bill 924 is one vote away. It could always be brought back and broadened. In Senator Kavanaugh's protection for natural hairstyles bills, that's a vote or two away. So I'm optimistic about those. There's a number of bills that the prosecutors, the police departments regularly fight, and that's sentencing reform, that's mandatory minimum reform, that's drug reform. I think many of the viewers are probably familiar with our state attorney general's position with respect to marijuana, medical marijuana, or any kind of marijuana reform. And I mentioned marijuana because that is one good example, or lack of, not good, but one clear example of disparate treatment for people of color. White, and I'm an old guy, so it's the younger kids consume marijuana, right? They all do it, regardless if they're white or people or black or whatever, but for whatever reason, that crime is just imposed so much more significantly or regularly on non-white people. And one way to resolve that is to lessen that penalty, is to moderate that penalty. It's not the same as other drugs. It's not as, it may be problematic. It may not be the best thing for people to do, but it need not be criminalized because that compounds it, whatever problems it may have, if it has any problems. And it certainly does make it worse for people to get caught up in the system. And that's one way that many people, non-white people, get caught up in the system. So I think many people are aware of our governor and our state's attorney general's position on that. They're opposed to any kind of change on that. So the only thing I can suggest to people who may be listening is that we do have a very unique body. We do have people who are truly citizen legislatures. They don't get paid really anything. They get paid $12,000 a year. That's $1,000 a month. Almost all of them, unless they're retired, have full-time jobs otherwise. They're not there for any other reason other than to represent their constituents. Mm-hmm. And there are many people who are in the body who do want to do meaningful change in response to their constituents. I say this to everybody. One thing I suggest people do is to find out who their senator is and contact them and let them know what bills you want them to support and why. And it needn't be a lengthy thing. You can simply send an email. You can appear at a town hall, if we have them, I guess now with COVID, or just a phone call or some similar request that they support certain bills. And these, I know, work with all these senators, they will listen. They'll listen to constituents and people who they represent many times before a lobbyist, many times before me. The reason you have a lobbyist is you want someone down there at all times sort of looking out and trying to remind senators, hey, do you remember at that listening session when the Judiciary Committee had, that one person said ABC, this is what you need to do, Senator. It's good to have somebody there, but what's really good is for people themselves to directly contact their senators. And more importantly, or as importantly, it's important for people to register to vote and to vote, because what we have is an opportunity for change, and that can be lost so easily by the next issue that comes on the horizon. But to preserve it, to vote for the people who you feel are going to represent and articulate the interests that you want, that is just so fundamentally important. The governor's made clear just this week earlier that they're likely going to make a new prison. Instead of trying to put fewer people in prison, we'll just make a new one, right? So that's one challenge, is that there are people who are just resistant to change. They don't feel or see the consequences of our current system of mass incarceration. They don't see it. It's not in their homes. It's not in their immediate lives. And they are just unwilling to change or embrace change. So the prosecutors, the cops, and to a lesser extent, probably the Attorney General and the governor. But I think the polling is clear. I read a headline of a poll, and I keep meaning to look it up, that something like 94% of the people want criminal justice reform. And Chief Schmatter and also Chief Bleimeister here in Lincoln have actually, to their credit, began to sort of look at reforming some of their own ways of policing. But the legislature could always do something at state level to compel that. Similar to what Senator Chambers' bill did to basically make every cop have 2 hours a year, the legislature could always pass some bills that would outright ban chokeholds, that would impose a duty on cops to intervene when one of their own does something improper with a suspect or someone who's in custody. So there's some things that can be done, and I think those things perhaps could wait till next year, only to give the local cities, the local governments a chance to do it, right? Do it themselves. If they can't do it, then the state can do it for them.
Mm-hmm. And like, what power does the governor have to like stop these bills that you said like have pretty good momentum and are probably going to pass?
The governor can always return a bill without a signature or veto it. And if that happens, then the legislature can always override that veto, and then the bill becomes law. Okay. So there's 49 senators. You only need 25 yes votes to pass a bill. If it's vetoed and comes back, they need 30 votes to override a governor's veto.
Okay.
So, and I don't know that the governor would do that. I think it would be, I mean, I can't speak for him. I don't work very closely with him. And I don't know what his mindset is. And in fairness to him, if they do amend some of these bills that we talked about that are pending, because they would always kind of amend them and rewrite them a bit in response to what's happened with James Spurlock, George Floyd, and all the other reactions to the protests. If they change those bills, then the governor may not, I mean, if you were to ask him, he may not be able to give you an answer because it hasn't got to his desk yet. He hasn't really had a chance to review it to see what it means. But if he could stop it by vetoing it, there's a way that he can kind of subtly work the legislature, just like any other lobbyist does, in the sense that he can go down there and talk to senators and have his people go down there and say, hey, don't pass this bill because I don't want to veto it, and I'm going to veto it. Mm-hmm. And I prefer it not come to me. There's always ways that the governor can work it that way. But the most direct power the governor has is to veto a bill that comes to him.
Mm-hmm. And if like only 25 legislators have already like voted yes on a bill and then the governor vetoes it, like how often does it happen that like 5 of them change their mind and the bill passes anyway?
It's possible. The most recent time that this Governor Ricks, had vetoes overridden has been obviously the repeal of the death penalty in 2015. That was vetoed by the governor, but they overrode that veto. Now we have the death penalty again because the governor and others supported a citizens' effort to repeal the law. Mm-hmm. So it depends on what the issue is. It depends on a couple of things. I said before, I think the legislature is filled up with people who really want to do the right thing. They come to government with some sort of not just to be puppets for the constituents, right? They come there with some sort of idea of what's important and what's right in this community, but they do listen. And if they are requested and pressured by their constituents to do a certain thing one way or the other, they generally are responsive to that. Mm-hmm. And I think if the governor vetoes something that may be close for a veto override, then I would just encourage anybody who is listening or viewing, as I said before, contact your state senator, tell them override the governor's veto on this bill, and here's why it's important to do so. Mm-hmm. And I think every senator there, well, most senators there, are going to be responsive to their constituents on that request.
How much does like momentum of the protests and the marches and everything, how much of an influence does that have on the legislators in Nebraska? Like, you know the makeup better than I do.
I think it has tremendous impact. You know, if you go back and they have a town hall and 10 people show up for it, right? And sometimes it's the same people, they want to talk about their one or two little sub issues. Mm-hmm. You know, Senator Lathrop is the chair of the Judiciary Committee, and he brought the committee to Omaha at UNO and then at NET in Lincoln to have listening sessions. And they were filled up all day. They had over 100 people, I think, each session in each city speak. I think that was very impressive on the senators on the Judiciary Committee and really anyone who's watching, because as a practical matter, I suppose you can go all night 24/7, but you've got a conference room reserved, right? You've got people who work there, have got to clean it up, but they had to close it down at some point each day, but there were still hundreds of people there at those places, and I think that matters significantly.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you so much
Thank you.
And to answer a whole bunch of questions. Yeah.
I hope I did okay.
No, that was great. Thank you so much.